Side 2. Chapter 10. While Dorian was having breakfast the next morning, Basil Hallward came to see him. "At last I've found you, Dorian," he said seriously. "I came last night, but they told me that you'd gone out to dinner with friends. I knew that wasn't true, of course. I wanted to tell you how sorry I was about Sybil Vane. Poor girl." "My dear Basil," said Dorian. He looked bored. "I was at Lord Henry's house last night. It was a very amusing evening." Basil stared at him. "You went out to dinner?" he said slowly. "You went out to dinner when Sybil Vane was lying dead in some dirty theatre?" "Stop, Basil! I won't listen to you." Dorian jumped to his feet. "Sybil Vane is in the past. Finished. Forgotten." "You've changed, Dorian," said Basil. "You have the same wonderful face, but where is the kind and gentle boy who sat for my portrait? Have you no heart?" "Yesterday my heart was full of sadness. I have cried for Sybil, yes, but I cannot cry today. I have changed, Basil. I'm a man now, with new feelings, new ideas. Don't be angry with me. I am what I am. There's nothing more to say." Basil watched him sadly. "Well, Dorian," he said at last, "I won't speak of poor Sybil again. But will you come and sit for another portrait soon?" "No, never," said Dorian quickly. "It's impossible." "But why?" asked Basil, very surprised. "And why have you covered the portrait?" He walked across the room towards the painting. Dorian cried out in fear and ran between Basil and the portrait. "No, Basil! You must not look at it. I don't want you to see it." His face was white and angry. "If you try to look at it, I'll never speak to you again." The artist stared at him. "Why can't I look at my own work?" he asked. "I'm going to exhibit it in an art gallery in Paris soon." Dorian tried to hide his fear. "But you told me that you would never exhibit the picture. Why have you changed your mind?" He came closer to Basil and looked into his face. "Tell me why," he said. Basil turned away. After a while he said slowly, "I see that you too have noticed something strange about the picture. Dorian, you changed my life as an artist from the moment when I met you. You became very important to me. I could not stop thinking about you. And when I painted this portrait, I felt that I'd put too much of myself into it. I could not let other people see it." He was silent for a moment, then turned back to Dorian. "Perhaps you're right. I cannot exhibit this picture. But will you let me look at it again?" "No, never." The artist smiled sadly. "Well, I've told you my secret now. Try to understand me, Dorian. You've been the one person in my life who has really influenced my art." As he left the room, Dorian Gray smiled to himself. What a dangerous moment that had been. Poor Basil. Although he had told his own secret, he had not discovered Dorian's secret. But the picture, he must hide it away at once. No one must ever see it again. He had the covered portrait carried upstairs to a small room at the top of the house. Then he locked the door and kept the key himself. He felt safe now, because only his eyes would see the terrible changes in that beautiful face. When he returned to the room downstairs, he picked up a book that Lord Henry had lent him. He sat down and began to read. It was the story of a Frenchman who had spent his life searching for beauty and pleasure. Pleasure of all kinds, both good and bad. Dorian read for hours. It was a frightening book, full of strange ideas and dangerous dreams. Dreams that slowly became real for Dorian. Dorian read this book many times. In fact, he could not stop reading it, and over the years it became more and more interesting to him. He felt that the Frenchman's life was a mirror of his own. The Thief of Time. Chapter 11. And so the years passed. But time did not touch the face of Dorian Gray. That wonderful beauty, the beauty that Basil Hallward had painted, never left him. He enjoyed the life of a rich and fashionable young man. He studied art and music, and filled his house with beautiful things from every corner of the world. But his search for pleasure did not stop there. He became hungry for evil pleasures. He became more and more in love with the beauty of his face, more and more interested in the ugliness of his soul. After a while, strange stories were heard about him, stories of a secret, more dangerous life. But when people looked at that young and good-looking face, they could not believe the evil stories, and they still came to the famous dinners at his house, where the food and the music and the conversation were the best in London. But behind the locked door at the top of the house, the picture of Dorian Gray grew older every year. The terrible face showed the dark secrets of his life. The heavy mouth, the yellow skin, the cruel eyes, these told the real story. Again and again, Dorian Gray went secretly to the room and looked first at the ugly and terrible face in the picture, then at the beautiful young face that laughed back at him from the mirror. After his 25th year, the stories about him became worse. He was sometimes away from home for several days. He was seen fighting with foreign sailors in bars. He was friendly with thieves. And in the houses of fashionable people, men sometimes turned away when he entered a room. Women's faces sometimes went white when they heard his name. But many people only laughed at these stories. Dorian Gray was still a very rich and fashionable man, and the dinners at his house were excellent. People agreed with Lord Henry, who once said, in his amusing way, that a good dinner was more important than a good life. As the months and years passed, Dorian Gray grew more and more afraid of the picture. He both hated it and loved it, and he became more and more afraid that someone would discover his secret. For weeks he tried not to go near it, but he could not stay away from it for long. Sometimes, when he was staying in friends' houses, he suddenly left and hurried back to London. He wanted to be sure that the room was still locked and the picture was still safe. At one time, he used to spend winters with Lord Henry in a little house in Algiers, but now he no longer travelled outside England. His fear grew stronger every year, and as time passed, the face in the picture grew slowly more terrible. The Hand of a Killer. Chapter 12. It was the 9th of November, the evening before his 38th birthday. Dorian Gray was walking home from Lord Henry's house when he saw Basil Hallward. He felt strangely afraid and tried to pretend that he had not seen him, but Basil hurried after him. "Dorian," he called, "what extraordinary luck! I'm catching the midnight train to Paris, and I wanted to see you before I left. I'll be away from England for 6 months. He put his hand on Dorian's arm. "Look, we're near your house. May I come in for a moment? I have something to say to you." "Of course. But won't you miss your train?" asked Dorian lazily as he walked up the steps to his door. "I have plenty of time. It's only 11 o'clock. They went in and sat down by the fire. "Now, my dear Dorian, I want to speak to you seriously," Basil began. "I must tell you that people in London are saying the most terrible things about you." Dorian lit a cigarette and looked bored. "I don't want to know anything about it. It doesn't interest me." "But it must interest you, Dorian," said Basil. "Every gentleman is interested in his good name. Of course, when I look at you, I know that these stories can't be true. A man's face shows if his life is good or bad. But why does Lord Berwick leave the room when you enter it? Why does Lord Staveley say that no honest woman is safe with you? That young soldier who was your friend, why did he kill himself? There was Sir Henry Ashton, who had to leave England with a bad name. And what about Lord Kent's son? What kind of life does he have now? Stop, Basil. You don't know what you're talking about, said Dorian coldly. Did I teach these people how to live their lives? And the people who tell these stories, are their lives any better than mine? And there are other stories too, continued Basil. Are they true? Can your life really be so bad, so evil? You were a fine young man once, but now when I hear these stories I wonder, do I know you at all? What has happened to the real Dorian Gray? I think I would have to see your soul before I could answer those questions. The real Dorian Gray? Asked Dorian quietly, his face white with fear. Yes, said the artist sadly, but only God can see your soul. A terrible laugh came from the younger man. Come, Basil, he cried. Come with me. I will show you what only God can see. Why not? It's your own work. You've talked enough about evil. Now you must look at it. He took Basil upstairs to the locked room. Inside, he turned to the artist with smiling lips and cold, hard eyes. You're the one man in the world who should know my secret. Are you sure that you want to? Yes. Then uncover that picture, Basil, and you will see my soul. A cry of horror came from the artist when he saw the terrible face in the portrait. How could that evil and unlovely face be Dorian Gray's? But yes, it was. He went nearer to the picture. It could not be the portrait that he had painted. But yes, there was his name written in the corner. He turned and looked at Dorian Gray with the eyes of a sick man. What does this mean? He asked at last. When you finished the portrait, replied Dorian, I made a wish. I remember, yes, said Basil. You wished that the picture could become old and that you could stay young. But this... He stared again at the picture. This is impossible. And you told me that you destroyed the picture. I was wrong. It has destroyed me. My God, Dorian, cried the artist. If this is true, if this is the face of your soul, then you are more evil than the worst of the stories about you. He sat down at the table and put his face in his hands. You must ask God for his help. It's too late, Basil. It's never too late, Dorian. Look at that terrible face. Look at it! Dorian turned and stared at the face in the picture, and suddenly he hated Basil more than he had ever hated anyone in his life. Basil now knew his secret and had seen the real Dorian Gray. Violent feelings burned inside Dorian. He picked up a knife from the table. Then the hate inside him exploded, and like a wild animal, he ran towards Basil and dug the knife into the artist's neck again and again and again. The murdered man's head fell forwards, and the blood ran slowly across the table and down onto the floor. Dorian stood and listened. He could hear nothing, only the drip, drip of blood onto the floor. He went to the window and looked down into the street. He felt strangely calm. The friend who had painted his portrait had gone out of his life. That was all. He locked the door behind him and went quietly downstairs. His servants were all in bed. He sat down and began to think. No one had seen Basil in Dorian's house tonight. Paris. Yes. Basil had gone to Paris, of course. So it would be 6 months before people asked where he was. 6 months. That was more than enough time. Dorian walked up and down the room. Then he took out a book from his desk and began to search for a name. Alan Campbell. Yes, that was the name that he wanted. Chapter 13. The next morning, Dorian wrote 2 letters. He put one of them into his pocket, and he gave the other to his servant. "Take this to Mr. Campbell's house at once," he said. While Dorian waited, he picked up a book and tried to read. But after a time, the book fell from his hand. Perhaps Alan Campbell was out of England. Perhaps he would refuse to come. He was a very clever scientist, and 5 years ago he and Dorian had been good friends. But now Alan never smiled when he met Dorian. Each minute seemed an hour to Dorian, but at last the door opened. Dorian smiled. "Alan," he said, "thank you for coming. I never wanted to enter your house again, but your letter said that it was a question of life and death," said Alan Campbell. His voice was hard and cold. "Yes, Alan, it is. Please, sit down." Across the table, the 2 men's eyes met. Dorian was silent for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "Alan, in a locked room upstairs, there is a dead body. I want you to destroy it. There must be nothing left. I know you can do this." "I don't want to know your terrible secrets. I refuse to help you," Campbell replied. "But you must, Alan. You're the only person who can help me." Dorian smiled sadly. He took a piece of paper, wrote something on it, and pushed it across the table to Campbell. As Campbell read the piece of paper, his face went white. He looked at Dorian with hate and fear in his eyes. "I'm so sorry for you, Alan," said Dorian gently. "I've already written a letter, and if you don't help me, I'll have to send it. But I think that you will help me." Campbell put his face in his hands and was silent for a long time. Dorian waited. "I'll need some things from my house," Campbell said at last. Dorian sent his servant to fetch the things that Campbell needed, and the 2 men waited silently. When the servant returned, Dorian took the scientist upstairs to the locked room. As they entered, Dorian remembered that the portrait was uncovered. He turned to cover it, then stopped and stared in horror. One of the hands in the picture was red with blood. For Dorian, this was more terrible than the dead body in the room. With shaking hands, he quickly covered the picture. "Leave me now," ordered Campbell. 5 hours later, Campbell came back downstairs. "I've done what you asked me to do," he said. "And now goodbye. I never want to see you again." When Campbell had left, Dorian went upstairs. There was a terrible smell in the room, but the dead body had gone. The Sailor, Chapter 14. Later the same evening, Dorian Gray was at a party. He smiled and talked and looked as young and as good-looking as ever. But his head ached, and at dinner he could not eat anything. When Lord Henry asked him if he felt unwell, Dorian said that he was tired and would go home early. At home he felt worse. Although the room was warm, his hand shook with cold. He wanted to forget for a while, to escape from the prison of his real life, and to lose himself in dreams. At midnight, in old dirty clothes, he left the house again and went to the East End of London. There he knew places where he could get opium, dark, evil places where people bought and sold the beautiful, terrible dreams of opium. He had been there many times before. He found the house that he was looking for and went into a long, low room. Men were lying on the dirty floor. A sailor was asleep on a table, and 2 women were drinking at the bar. As Dorian hurried up the narrow stairs, the sweet, heavy smell of opium came to meet him, and he smiled in pleasure. But in the room he saw a young man who had once been his friend. He turned away and went downstairs again to drink at the bar. One of the women spoke to him. "Don't talk to me," said Dorian angrily, and walked towards the door. "I remember you. You're Prince Charming, aren't you?" she shouted after him. The sleeping sailor woke up when he heard these words, and as Dorian left the house, the sailor hurried after him. Dorian walked quickly along the road, but as he reached a corner, hands closed around his neck. A man pulled him backwards and pushed him against a wall. Dorian fought wildly and pulled the hands away. Then he saw the gun in the man's hand. "What do you want?" he said quickly. "Keep quiet," said the man. "If you move, I'll shoot you." "You're crazy. What have I done to you?" "You destroyed the life of Sybil Vane," answered the sailor. "And Sybil Vane was my sister. She killed herself because of you. I've been looking for you for years, but I only knew the name that she used to call you, Prince Charming. Well, tonight I heard your name, and tonight you're going to die." Dorian Gray grew sick with fear. "I never knew her. I've never heard of her. You're crazy," he cried. Suddenly he had an idea. "How long ago did your sister die?" he asked. 18 years ago, James Vane replied. "Why do you ask me?" 18 years? laughed Dorian Gray. "Take me to the light and look at my face." James Vane stared at Dorian, then he pushed him towards the light, and in the light he saw the face of a boy of 20. This man was too young. He was not the man who had destroyed his sister's life. "My God!" he cried. "I nearly murdered you." "Go home and put that gun away before you get into trouble," said Dorian, and he walked quickly away. James Vane stared after him in horror. Then a woman's hand touched his arm. "Why didn't you kill him?" she asked. "He's evil." "He's not the man that I'm looking for," answered the sailor. "The man who I want must be nearly 40 now. That man is only a boy." "A boy?" The woman laughed. Her voice was hard. "It's 18 years since I met Prince Charming, and his pretty face hasn't changed in all that time. It's true, I promise you." James Vane ran to the corner of the road, but Dorian Gray had disappeared. Chapter 15. A week later, Dorian Gray was at his house in the country, where he had invited Lord Henry and several other friends. Among them was the pretty Lady Monmouth and her much older husband. Lady Monmouth was amusing and clever, and seemed to like Dorian Gray very much. One afternoon, as they laughed and talked together during tea, Dorian went out to fetch a flower for Lady Monmouth's dress. Lord Henry smiled at Lady Monmouth. "I hope you're not in love with Dorian, my dear. He's very dangerous." She laughed. "Oh, men are much more interesting when they're dangerous." Just then they heard the sound of a heavy fall. Lord Henry ran out of the room and found Dorian lying unconscious on the floor. When Dorian opened his eyes, Lord Henry said, "My dear Dorian, you must take care of yourself. You're not well." Dorian stood up slowly. "I'm all right, Harry. I'm all right." As he dressed for dinner in his room, Dorian remembered what he had seen, and cold fear ran through him like a knife. He had seen a face watching him at the window, and he had recognized it. It was the face of James Vane. The next day he did not leave the house. In fact, for most of the day he stayed in his room, sick with fear. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw again the sailor's face. He tried to tell himself that he had dreamt it. Yes, it was impossible. Sybil Vane's brother did not know his name, and was probably on his ship at sea. No, of course he had not seen James Vane's face at the window. But the fear stayed with him, dream or no dream. 2 days passed, and Dorian grew less afraid. On the third day, a clear, bright winter morning, Dorian joined his friends on a shooting party. With Lady Monmouth by his side, he walked to the edge of the forest where the men were shooting at birds and small animals. The cold air and the sounds and smells of the forest filled Dorian with happiness. Suddenly, one of the men shot into the trees near them. There were two cries in the morning air, the cry of an animal and the cry of a man, both in pain. There were shouts and calls from the men, and then a man's body was pulled from the trees. Dorian turned away in horror. Bad luck seemed to follow him everywhere. People began to walk back towards the house. Lord Henry came over to tell Dorian that the man was dead. Dorian shook his head. "Oh, Harry," he said slowly, "I feel that something terrible is going to happen to some of us. To me, perhaps." Lord Henry laughed at this idea. "What could happen to you, Dorian? You have everything in the world that a man can want. Forget about this accident. It was just an accident, not murder." Then he added with a smile, "But it would be very interesting to meet a person who had murdered somebody." "What a terrible thing to say!" cried Lady Monmouth. "Don't you agree, Mr. Grey?" "Mr. Grey, are you ill again? Your face is so white." Dorian smiled and tried to speak calmly. "It's nothing," he said quietly. "But please excuse me. I think I must go and lie down." Upstairs in his room, Dorian's body shook with fear like a leaf in the wind. He felt that he could not stay another night in the house. Death walked there in the sunlight. He decided to return immediately to London and to visit his doctor. His servant came to pack his clothes, and while he was doing this, he told Dorian that the dead man was a sailor, but no one knew his name. "A sailor?" cried Dorian. He jumped to his feet. A wild hope filled him. "I must see the body at once." He hurried to the house where the body lay, and when he uncovered the face of the dead man, he saw that it was James Vane. He cried with happiness, and knew that now he was safe. The Picture. Chapter 16. "You're going to be good?" said Lord Henry. "Don't tell me that. You're wonderful as you are. Please, don't change." His long white fingers played with a flower on the table. It was spring in London, and the two friends were having dinner at Lord Henry's house. Dorian Gray shook his head. "No, Harry. I've done too many terrible things in my life, and I'm going to change. I began my good life yesterday, in the country." "My dear boy," smiled Lord Henry, "everybody can be good in the country. There's nothing to do in the country, so it's impossible to do anything bad. But tell me, how did you begin your good life?" "There was a girl in a village, a very beautiful girl, an honest country girl. She loved me and was ready to come away with me yesterday, but I said no. I refused to destroy her young life, and I've left her as honest as I found her." Lord Henry laughed. "You've left her with a broken heart, you mean? How can she be happy now with a country boy after she has known you?" "Don't, Harry," cried Dorian. "Can you never be serious? I'm sorry that I told you now. Let's talk about other things. What's been happening in London?" "Oh, people are still discussing poor Basil and how he disappeared. I don't know why, because there are plenty of other things that they can talk about. My wife has run away with another man. Alan Campbell has killed himself. What do you think has happened to Basil?" asked Dorian slowly. "I've no idea," answered Lord Henry. "The English police report that Basil went to Paris on the midnight train on the 9th of November, but the French police say that he never arrived in Paris at all. If Basil wants to hide himself, I really don't care. And if he's dead, I don't want to think about him. Death is the only thing that really frightens me. I hate it." "Harry, don't people say that Basil was murdered?" said Dorian. "Some of the newspapers say so," replied Lord Henry. "But who would want to murder poor Basil? He wasn't clever enough to have enemies. What will you say, Harry, if I tell you that I murdered Basil? Asked Dorian. He watched his friend carefully. Lord Henry smiled. No, my dear Dorian, murder wouldn't please you. You like a different kind of pleasure. And you should never do anything that you cannot talk about after dinner. He lifted his coffee cup. What happened to the fine portrait that Basil painted of you? I haven't seen it for years. Didn't you tell me that it was stolen? What a pity. Oh, I never really liked it, said Dorian. I prefer not to think about it. For a while the two men were silent. Then the older man lay back in his chair and looked at Dorian with half-closed eyes. Tell me how you have kept your youth and your wonderful beauty, Dorian. You must have some secret. I'm only 10 years older than you, and I look like an old man. But you haven't changed since the day when I first met you. What a wonderful life you've had. Yes, said Dorian slowly. It's been wonderful, Harry, but I'm going to change it now. You don't know everything about me. His friend smiled. You cannot change to me, Dorian. You and I will always be friends. Dorian stood up. I'm tired tonight, Harry. I must go home. I'll see you at lunch tomorrow. Good night. At the door he stopped for a moment and looked back, but then he turned and went out without another word. Chapter 17. At home he thought about his conversation with Lord Henry. Could he really change, he wondered? He had lived an evil life and had destroyed other people's lives as well. Was there any hope for him? Why had he ever made that wish about the picture? He had kept his youth and beauty, but he had paid a terrible price for it. His beauty had destroyed his soul. He picked up a mirror and stared at his face. What was he now? A face without a heart. Suddenly he hated his own beauty and dropped the mirror on the floor, where it broke into many small pieces. James Vane, Basil Hallward, Sybil Vane. These deaths were not important to him now. It was better not to think of the past. Nothing could change that. He must think of himself. Perhaps, he thought, if I live a better life, the picture will become less ugly. He remembered the pretty village girl. He had not destroyed her young life. He had done one good thing. Perhaps the picture had already begun to look better. He went quietly upstairs to the locked room. Yes, he would live a good life, and he need not be afraid any more of the evil face of his soul. But when he uncovered the picture, he gave a cry of pain. There was no change. The face in the picture was still terrible, more hateful if possible than before, and the red on the hand seemed brighter, like new blood. He stared at the picture with hate and fear in his eyes. Years ago he had loved to watch it changing and growing old. Now he could not sleep because of it. It had stolen every chance of peace or happiness from him. He must destroy it. He looked round and saw the knife that had killed Basil Hallward. Now it will kill the artist's work, he said to himself. It will kill the past, and when that is dead, I will be free. He picked up the knife and dug it into the picture. There was a terrible cry and a loud crash. The servants woke, and two gentlemen who were passing in the road below stopped and looked up at the house. A policeman came by, and they asked him, "Whose house is that?" "Mr. Dorian Gray's, sir," was the answer. The two gentlemen looked at each other, then turned away from the house and walked on. Inside the house, the servants talked in low, frightened voices. After some minutes, they went up to the room. They knocked, but there was no reply. They called out. Nothing. They could not open the door, so they climbed down from the roof and got in through the window. Against the wall, they saw a fine portrait of the young Dorian Gray, in all his wonderful youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man with a knife in his heart. His face was old and ugly and yellow with disease. Only the rings on his fingers told them who he was.
Intelligence officer Longfellow.
Tonight, we are attacking Crefeld. You are attacking Crefeld.
Right.
You can come with us, sir.
You can sit on my knee, sir.
Over. First, a word to you, bombing. Now, I've said this before, but I think it's worth saying again. Some of you are still dropping your bombs early and short of target. Lighter. First line, please, Corporal. This photograph was taken 3 minutes into the raid on Essen last week. Next one. 5 minutes in. Next. 7 minutes in. You see the bombs landing further and further away from the center as the raid progresses. Now you know the name for this. It is called creepback. Some people say the reason for creepback is optical illusion. But I think it's more about crews getting cold feet. I know people are reluctant to talk about it, but I want no bloody creepback tonight, clear? Do the blasting job properly, hit Crefeld, not the countryside around it. All right, I know when flak is coming up, everyone gets itchy finger.
Although it was never told to crews at briefing, Bomber Command in fact made allowance for creepback by having target indicators dropped on the far side of the area they wanted destroyed.
In the countryside, why are we sending you all the way to Germany? We've got plenty of potato fields here at home.
You bloody armchair warriors. They'll fight to the last drop of some other bugger's blood.
We were all of us launched on a sort of wave of fate, I suppose, almost, and we were rolled along by it, questioning of the objective of what we were doing. Bomber crews being very individual and not going much for sort of the usual disciplines. Somehow it wouldn't extend to asking that sort of question.
Go out there tonight and rip the guts out of the Hun in Crefeld.
Sir.
Hell's teeth, what are you doing, Sam? Sit down, mate.
It's all right, Debbie, I'm going to ask a question. Sir,
Yes?
I'd like to know exactly what are the guts of Crefeld, sir.
What?
Flight Sergeant Sam Lambert, B-Flight. My question is, what exactly are we aiming at in the centre of that city? Tenements? People's houses? I mean, what's there? Hospitals? What?
Good question, Mr. Lambert. Tell the men what we're destroying, Mr. Longfellow. I don't think any of them are fifth columnists.
The Deutsche Edelstahlwerk, that's a major steelworks, and a Gestapo headquarters.
In my experience, they were always viable targets relating to industry, but never specifically just the workers' dwellings.
You all right, Skipper?
Yeah. Yeah, what's it matter? What's there? We're going to bomb it anyway.
Word for wireless, chaps.
Haven't any much to add to what you already have.
Well, Mr. Sweet, I see what you mean about Lambert.
Sir?
Nearly unsettled the whole squadron. Oh, well done, Longfellow. Good work.
Thank you, sir.
One rotten apple, that's all it takes, sir. Lambert's definitely got a touch of the jitters. We better have him out of Wally before he infects anyone else.
Thank you, Miss Green. Now, the latest from Met. Mr. Younger.
Thank you, Luke.
There was an alternative, but it was called LMF, lack of moral fibre. And if you can imagine some poor boy going through what they went through for, say, 20 flights, and then he cracks, and he's thrown out, muck, scum on the lack of moral fibre.
You couldn't say I've had enough. You could. And what was it? LMF, lack of moral fibre. And you were invalided out and stripped and cleaning out the latrines or whatever, you see. Work's job. Had a certain amount of ignominy with it. I suppose today you'd see a psychiatrist and get compensation or something, I don't know.
Oh no, you went back because, that was the alternative, and you couldn't face that alternative of LMF.
Freezing cloud between 17 and 20,000. Winds northeasterly around 20 miles per hour over the target.
and less than, say, 15 to 17 on the route.
The Met Man's outline of the weather situation was based on a forecast which showed the curving line of the low front, in places, more than 200 miles in error. Even at Krunsvig, the sun made an appearance, as Oberleutnant Victor Löwenherz accompanied two men along the edge of the airfield.
I find this all very strange. Secret police and military intelligence working together.
I'm so pleased to meet you in person, Herr Baron Oberleutnant. I've seen you often in newsreels, and of course, your photograph in Signal, a true Reich hero.
Blessing here said something about espionage.
Did he? Untersturmbahn Fury Blessing, I told you to wait for me.
What am I accused of? Should I have a lawyer present?
A certain medical file has been stolen. Our friend Blessing here has been watching one of your men and believes it to be in his possession.
Who are you accusing, Blessing?
Has he shown it to you?
Who?
You were talking to him just a short time ago.
I've spoken to virtually all 12 pilots on my wing today. I am their Staffelkapitän.
Which of them do you think might have done it?
None of them.
Tell him, Blessing.
Unteroffizier Himmel.
Oh, Christian Himmel. Himmel has the Knight's Cross.
What does that prove? So do you.
Please, excuse Blessing, Herr Baron. You're not under suspicion. But Unteroffizier Himmel...
Do you have evidence?
Himmel had the file in his bedside locker. I found it there early this morning. He left his quarters at 9 o'clock. My people checked his locker again. It was gone. You're the only person he saw.
This is your evidence. Anyone could have planted it, including yourself, Blessing. What does Himmel say?
He doesn't know we're onto him. We wanted to see who else was in this spy ring.
I have known Christian Himmel for 3 years. He's not interested in anything but aircraft and flying. He is not political.
What were you discussing this afternoon?
Oil leaks.
Really?
I've nothing more to say. I would stake my life on his loyalty.
That is exactly what you are doing.
How did he seem, Herr Baron? Anxious, depressed, worried about him?
They seemed his usual self.
You hesitate.
We're night fighter pilots, Herr Dr. Starkov. It is more dangerous work than snooping in people's bedside lockers. Sometimes we wonder just how long our luck will hold out.
Why?
It's natural to feel a little apprehensive from time to time. And that is how Himmel is feeling today.
We're very interested to have this file back, and of course to learn who has seen it.
Christian would not do something like this.
In that case, cooperate with us and prove his innocence.
Right, I'll be happy to. And when I do, I shall be speaking to my own contacts at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin about exactly what we pilots have to put up with from you. Blessing.
Come on.
Krunsvig Luftwaffe Station. Oberleutnant Victor Löwenherz waits for the phone to be answered at Military Intelligence HQ.
Dr. Starkov, please.
I was expecting you to ring von Löwenherz.
Well, how did you know it was me?
I understand you've been making inquiries.
Yes. I've spoken to Dr. Firth at the medical center. He confirmed the file was taken.
Does Himmel still have the file?
I have it here.
Himmel has sent you a copy?
Well, not exactly.
Any letter with it?
Letter?
You seem rather confused, Herr Oberleutnant.
There's no letter, there's only the document.
Good.
What do you want me to do with it?
Hold on to it until I see you tomorrow.
I've no safe.
It's not as secret as all that. I have 14 other copies on my desk.
14?
It has been widely circulated officially to medical units at Luftwaffe stations.
I see.
So there's no need for you to worry about one copy. Himmel has been sending them to many people, too. I can't imagine why yours has not been intercepted.
This is an official report, then?
Reich Marshal Goering himself sent a letter of congratulation to its author.
Have you read it?
Yes.
And?
What do you want me to say?
I found it rather shocking.
We are at war, Herr Oberleutnant. Maybe this research will save you from freezing to death one day if you come down to the North Sea. Ask yourself, who would you rather see die of cold? Yourself or some troublemaking Jews?
What about Himmel?
He'll be arrested first thing tomorrow. I'm sure you agree it's preferable we do it rather than Blessing.